Hello, everyone. In the last episode, Stephanie from San Antonio, she mentioned the Clovis Culture podcast or the Clovis Culture Custom Nutrition Plans. It's a company led by a friend of mine, Justin Nault. And Justin, of course, has a podcast called the Clovis Culture Podcast. I've actually been on it. Recommend you check it out. It's a great podcast. He's a great friend, a great person. And I've actually been on there analyzing his genetic variants. He's such a great guy. I mean, when he was starting, or when he saw that I was starting a podcast, he actually sent me this episode. He sent me the episode that he recorded. So that's what I'm going to present to you today. And of course, the audio quality isn't perfect. I mean, he had a microphone. I was being recorded via Skype, so bear that in mind. But hopefully you can still enjoy the episode. So thanks for listening, and be sure to check out ajconsultingcompany.com if you want to have your DNA analyzed, and I look forward to meeting you if you do.
What's up, everybody? Justin Nault here with another episode of the Clovis Culture. Today, I am joined once again by the amazing, incredible, brilliant Dr. Anthony J. And today we're going to be diving into genetics, genetics testing, the human genome, I guess we'd call it. So I'll let Anthony just let us know what we're going to be doing today.
Yeah, rock on. I mean, so you actually sent me your DNA data from what, 23andMe or Ancestry? I forget.
Yep, that was 23andMe, just the raw data.
Yep, exactly. And that's the beauty of both of those companies, Ancestry.com, 23andMe.com. They send you you can access your own raw data file. Some of these DNA sequencing companies, they won't even give you your own data. So they'll do your DNA, and then they keep all the information on there and they won't even give it to you. So if you do have your DNA done, make sure it's through a company that will actually give you the data.
I didn't even realize some companies did that. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's absurd, but it doesn't mean anything to most people, right? It's like thousands of pages of just code, right?
Yeah.
So for most people, it's not even beneficial. But of course, there's a free online software you can use to kind of look through some of these genes that you might have problems with or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I use it, and I have my own software. I have my own custom written script that I use, and it spits out a report for me, and it analyzes people's genetics, and then I go through that with people through my consulting company.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been doing that for a lot of years now. I started my consulting company in 2010. And I actually started it because I don't remember if we probably didn't talk about this last time, but I used to design viruses. I was a virus designer.
We did touch on that briefly. Yeah, you worked for the government, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so
Crazy.
So I started a consulting company in order to basically get these contracts that I was doing anyways.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say virus designer, I was creating these neutered viruses, we call them, because you take out all the bad genes and you basically design the DNA, you put it in human cells, and then the human cells will spit. I mean, these are just cells in a dish, right?
Right.
But the cells will actually spit out virus for you into the liquid that the cells grow in. And then you harvest those viruses, you centrifuge them down, you spin them down. Wow. And then you can take those viruses, inject them into animals, and do all kinds of genetic manipulations in animal studies to try and cure Alzheimer's and things. It wasn't like we were making evil viruses.
Right.
We were actually trying to do some beneficial research with them.
Mm-hmm.
But then, of course, just with all that DNA work I was doing, this was all in the midst of 23andMe having issues with the FDA because they were basically sticking their middle finger up at the FDA and saying, you guys can't shut us down. The FDA shut them down. And then so people were coming to me and saying, well, can you look at my DNA code? Because 23andMe is unable to do anything with this genetic information, but I still have all this DNA information. So people were coming to me, and I did my own, I did, all my extended family, all this. And it's really powerful, the information you get. And even today, 23andMe, they'll give you these reports. And you probably have experienced this, where they give you like a report and it'll tell you your eye color.
Yeah.
It'll tell you like if you have a photic reflex, if you're going to sneeze when you go out in the sun or things like this, like just meaningless information.
Yeah, they even say like you probably don't like cilantro or whatever. Like
yeah, it might taste like soap. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like, people get those reports and they think that the information is just really limited, so all they use it for is ancestry. But in reality, the health information is there. It's super interesting and quite deep.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, what we're going to go through today so that people can understand some of the potential. And I guess we'll use your genetics to kind of frame that discussion.
Yeah, and I obviously have, I'm excited about this for selfish reasons, just because I want to dive into my information as well. But yeah, I've looked into like the like Promethease. I've run mine through Promethease. Yep. I did one called DNA Fit, which was not free. That was a little pricey. But yeah, it really is. Without having like I don't have a PhD in biochem or like a background in genetics or anything. So it's even something like Promethease was just so overwhelming for me. I'm like, Wait a minute, what am I even looking at here? It's really, really complex.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. That's the other extreme. I mean, on the one extreme, you've got these reports that are pretty much meaningless and just superficial and silly. And then on the far other extreme, you've got way too much information. And the reason for that is they'll list all the associations. So like scientists will do a study on a specific gene and they'll find like a 1.3-fold increased risk for something, like 1.3-fold increased risk for some kind of cancer or something.
Yeah.
Or 1.5-fold increased risk for this kind of cancer, 1.4-fold increased risk for that kind of cancer, whatever. And you can get these online reports and it'll give you like hundreds of pages of those risks that you have for all these little things. The problem with that is when scientists repeat those exact studies with larger groups of people, they virtually never hold up.
Okay.
Because the association is so small and humans are so diverse. And
yeah.
So the problem is it's confusing more so than helpful because people are all concerned about all these millions of risks that they have or thousands of risks or whatever. I mean, we have 25,000 genes. So, there's a lot of potential there to have just pages and pages and pages of, association studies. And so anyways, what I look for is anything that's twofold or higher.
Okay. So that would be a 200% increase, right?
Well, it depends. I mean, usually you'd say 100%, but it depends.
Okay, that's a twofold. Okay, thank you for clearing that up. Like, wait a minute, 2x or?
Yeah. But with these association studies, they're done a little bit differently in certain cases, and it does depend on the gene and what the biochemistry is and what the gene is doing and the function of the enzyme, whatever. Because sometimes, for example, you'll have a genetic study and it'll show like a 70%. Well, let me just use a specific example, right?
Okay.
So one of the specific examples I look at is beta carotene conversion. Your body doesn't use beta carotene. People think carotene is a vitamin, right? Vitamin A. And plants make carotene. So people say eat carrots, they're good for your eyes. That's where carotene was discovered. It was discovered in carrots. And that's what makes carrots orange. So they say eat carrots, they're good for your eyes. But the problem is a lot of people have a genetic issue where they have literally like an 80% reduced ability to convert carotene to retinol. Retinol is what's good for your eyes. That's where retinol was discovered. That's the actual vitamin A in animals, right? So plants, carotene, animals, retinol. And you have to convert that. So if you eat carrots, if you eat plants, you have to convert the carotene to retinol for you to use it. But some people literally have an 80% reduced conversion of that process. And of course, those people need to get retinol, right? It's like the carotene is not really helping them out. So rather than trying to eat carrots, it's better to eat liver, right? Because liver is by far the most rich source of retinol, and it's a hugely important vitamin, especially for your stem cells and your immune system.
Yeah.
People talk about the eyes, right? Like retinol because it's named retinol, but in reality, if you're getting sick all the time, you're probably just deficient in retinol.
Okay.
I mean, it depends. There's a lot of factors. Maybe you're exposed to mold, who knows, whatever. But the point is, a lot of cases where people just have a really poor immune system, they just aren't getting enough retinol, and they think they are because they're eating carrots, whatever. But that's one of these things where you don't find the association studies in human studies, but you look at the actual enzyme, the actual thing that's converting beta carotene to retinol, and you see an 80% problem, right?
Right. That's significant.
That's a similar kind of situation where I'll flag that, like that's a big deal. And here's another caveat with that. And the reason genetics are so important is because, excuse me, if you just take that one gene and you say, well, all I want to know about is that one gene, right? So then you can decide whether carrots are sufficient for getting your retinol or whether you need to get liver or something like that, right?
Sure.
Because liver is by far the biggest, the most effective way to get more retinol. The problem with that is a lot of people have high iron genes.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that today.
Exactly, because you've got one of these genes.
Yeah.
It's like in your case, it's called the homeostatic iron regulator. It's HFE, FE meaning iron in science. And if you've got problematic iron genes, and then you're eating loads of liver to get that retinol, well, that's a really risky situation. And I know a lot of people that do that. I was just at a conference. It's the Weston A. Price conference. I gave a couple talks there.
Yeah.
One of them was actually 2-hour talk on estrogen. And then, of course, another talk I gave was just a normal 1-hour talk, and it was on stem cells, which actually included some of this information on retinol specifically. But, like everybody in the Weston A. Price, I love the movement because they have all these great farmers and this network of farmers that are raising animals in a real sustainable, healthy way without the sprays and the herbicides and the atrazine and all this. And so I was talking to a lot of people at lunch, and everybody's eating liver. It's like part of the group, like basically you have to eat liver if you're going to be part of the group,
Absolutely. Yeah.
And a lot of the people, man, they had really high iron.
Yeah.
And they were concerned about it, but there's a lot of other people that kind of scoff at the concern. But in reality, I'm more worried if you've got high iron than if you've got low iron, because high iron is more of a risk for damaging your arteries.
Right. And that was what I discussed that with Paul Saladino, because I was eating 4 ounces of liver a day. So I have a bunch of local farmers here that I know that are all, rotational grazing, regenerative agriculture. It's fantastic. So I just get these loads of liver for a great price because I know the guys, and I was eating 4 ounces of liver a day. And then we get, like I sent you that blood work earlier this morning as well, which is like my ferritin levels like off the charts. And then Paul goes to my 23andMe data, and he's just like, oh, you have one of these SNPs that you're talking about for hemochromatosis, I guess.
Exactly.
So I want to dig into all that, but so first, I just want to let people know too that the I guess the danger here, the most famous story of this would be like an example, Angelina Jolie,
right,
who ran her 23andMe data and then decides to get what we would call, I guess, a preventative mastectomy, and which was probably completely unnecessary. So that's where this can get kind of dangerous, where you'd really want somebody like you. Because there are a lot of companies right now. It's like, pay me $15 and I'll send you this printed PDF of your what to do with your nutrition and stuff. And that gets a little scary, I think.
Yeah, that's why you have to sit down and talk to people about it, I feel, because the reports, unless you're an actual scientist or you've actually had training in a lot of this information, it's one of those things you really need to sit down and discuss some of the intricacies in certain cases. You don't always need to discuss every intricacy. Obviously, it's a waste of time, but there's always these questions that come up where they should come up. It's funny, we were just before the show, we were talking about Joe Rogan and Chris Kresser and what's the MMA fighter with the documentary?
James Wilkes,
and that whole discussion. And apparently somebody had said that, and this was on that episode, somebody had said, oh, you did 1,000 hours or 3,000 hours of research. They should just give you a PhD, right? And I just kind of laugh at that because, every like Twitter nerd, like PubMed searching nerd should have a PhD if that's actually true, because the problem with that idea, like give him a PhD. He's looked at science data for 1,000 hours. The problem is that is part of the process of doing science is actually doing these experiments so the weaknesses, right? So you don't just totally jump in with both feet and believe everything the studies say.
Right.
You have to actually have experience doing studies in certain cases.
Yeah.
Really understand the flaws or the weaknesses or the interpretation, and how scientists sometimes will spin the information to try and make it look better and this and that.
So that's the other problem I see is people that even if you've spent any amount of time on PubMed or Google Scholar or anything like that, like you can absolutely pull up any study, scroll down to the bottom and be like, conclusion, and just read that. And you just decide that this is the way things are. And the other thing is, like, I tell people this all the time. Like, I have a bunch in my office, I have a bunch of biochemistry textbooks, and like guys like Rob Wolf have been like, read this biochemistry textbook. And I'm like, he's a biochemist. Cool. I'm going to read this textbook. That doesn't mean that I understand this at the level that he does. It's just not the case. Like, I would never say I've read these 4 or 5 biochemistry textbooks, I'm an expert in biochemistry. Not even close. It's so much more intricate than that. It's like, you've devoted your life to that the way I devoted my life to being a professional musician. So it's like, if you want to learn how to be an expert musician, sure, I'll help you with that.
Right. It's a good example. Yeah. Yeah. It's a great example because it would be like somebody who is just reading books about music and has never actually played an instrument saying that they should have a PhD in music or something.
Exactly. Yeah. I look at like the outlier Malcolm Gladwell stuff and I'm like, oh, like I literally crossed 10,000 hours of stage time when I was like 18 years old.
Wow. Awesome. Yeah. Yeah. I just went to, I'm sure you've heard of Chris Janson. I just went to a Chris Janson concert, man. That guy's
cool.
He's awesome. He's a country music star who he plays the harmonica like a fiend, and he was playing the drums at his own concert. And of course, he's the main act. He's like the singer as well. And
I love when guys do that, when they do
he goes around and takes other people's instruments.
Yep. That's killer, man. And that's how you know you're dealing with a serious musician too. In my opinion, I don't know, people can debate that, but yeah. So I want to give people an idea too of just a couple things before. So when we dive into this actual report, I'm going to put all my, I want to share all this stuff with everybody. So I'll put my blood work, my the report that you gave me, I'll put in the show notes for this show. But I just want to give people an example, like someone who's coming to this completely cold,
Mm-hmm.
if we can just walk them through what you're looking for. So like the genome, terms like SNPs, heterozygous, homozygous. Can you just kind of give us a little briefing before we begin?
Yeah, for sure. And I usually just avoid the hetero-homozygous terms. And
okay,
just for simplicity, I just basically tell people, look, in every cell in our body, we have 2 copies of DNA,
mm-hmm.
right? Except egg and sperm cells. Egg and sperm cells only have 1 copy. A lot of scientists don't even think about that. They don't realize that. But it's true, only 1 copy of DNA in the egg and sperm cell. And then, of course, when they fuse together, that's where you got your copy of DNA from your mother and the copy of DNA from your father.
Right.
And that's also where you get this idea in science about plus or plus minus or minus, because if you've got 2 copies of a gene, then you've got 2 options, right? So you can have a bad gene from your mother and a bad gene from your father, and that would be considered a plus. But maybe you only have a bad gene from one parent, but then you've got a good gene from the other parent. That would be considered a plus minus.
Okay.
Right. And then minus, of course, would be 2 good genes. And I would just, I ignore those, right? I'm not interested in your good genes. You have thousands of them. Everybody has thousands of awesome genes, and it's kind of pointless to spend hours and hours talking about the good genes. Now, it's a little bit arbitrary though, because, certain genes, like you might have a plus for fast twitch muscles, or you might have a plus for slow twitch muscles, and neither of those are bad.
Mm-hmm.
But they are important to know. Like, it's useful to know that information. So it's not always good versus bad, but I use those terms just to make it easier for people.
Sure.
So there's always that debate about what's bad,
Yeah.
So anyways, but in general, the pluses I'm looking at are to some degree bad, problematic, dysfunctional in our modern society. And so let's figure out ways to fix it.
Right. Well, and then you have the idea of epigenetics as well, too, because there's this idea like you're not doomed by these genetics, right?
Yeah, but it's super important to understand that the DNA is a blueprint. So like if you've got a blueprint that's going to, lead to a bad bathroom or something in a house, and you just keep using that blueprint to make new houses, you're always going to have a bad bathroom unless you do something on top of that to fix it.
Right. Okay.
So the blueprint, if it is problematic, it is going to be problematic. But the good news is you can fix it, right? Like the beta carotene example. It's like if you've got a problem converting carotene to retinol, you're always going to have that problem converting beta carotene to retinol, no matter how much exercise you do or other supplements. The main solution would be just to take the actual retinol supplement. So you can fix it, but it's almost like adding another bathroom onto the house or something like that. Like the blueprint's messed up. Let's just find a workaround. So it's not a perfect analogy, but definitely epigenetics are hugely important. I mean,
sure,
can't underestimate them because they'll turn genes on and off.
Yeah. But I guess a good example would be like, if you have bright blue eyes, we can't look at your genetics and be like, if you eat a bunch of beet,
right,
you'll have brown eyes now. It just doesn't work that way.
Exactly. There's definitely some genes that are hardwired, and we're not going to fix them. Thankfully, most of the differences, they're modified. You can modify them. Mm-hmm. These subtle changes with these different genes, you can actually do things to up or down regulate you can fix the issue essentially.
Okay.
And we'll get through it. I mean, and people will see that, I think, as we go through the genes.
Okay.
But like I said, the context matters, because if you're just looking at one gene, you always have to think, what about these other genes that might also play a role? And like a good example of that right off the top, if you open up the PDF,
yep,
and you see the gene called FOXO3, FOXO3.
Oh yeah, got it.
Brain optimization. So basically, for people that are listening, I actually have 5 different categories that I look at. The first one being the brain, the second one being diet, and then I look at detox and hormone genes and vitamin genes, like basically detox, vitamin, hormone, all those like kind of lumped together. That would be category 3. Category 4 would be the gym and training. And then finally, the category 5 would be sleep, your sleep genes. So those are the 5 categories we're looking at.
Awesome.
And the first chunk of genes I'm looking for are Alzheimer's risk genes.
Right.
And the interesting thing about those is, even if oftentimes Alzheimer's is like the far extreme. It's like, if you've gotten to the point where you've got Alzheimer's, you've done something wrong for a lot of years.
Yes.
So usually, in my opinion, you can prevent Alzheimer's if you start real early and doing the right thing in the right way. The problem is there's a lot of different Alzheimer's risks, right? I mean, like you'll see here, there's 5 different categories that I have. Some people get Alzheimer's because they have chronic inflammation. And there's actually genes in your brain that are involved in clearing inflammatory products and dealing with inflammation in your brain. And that's different from inflammation in your joints and different from other forms of inflammation, right? Sometimes inflammation is very localized. It's not just throughout your whole body. It might just be chronic inflammation in your joints. And then you get a blood test. It doesn't look like you've got inflammation, so you think you're fine.
Right.
Similar with the brain, like for the most part, researchers aren't tapping into your cerebral spinal fluid and checking for inflammatory chemicals that are actually in the fluid in your brain, right? Because you have to tap into your spinal cord to do those studies.
Yeah.
And, that sort of thing. So that's just one category of Alzheimer's. Another risk would be heavy metals, for example, and you don't have any genes in either of these categories. So I'm bringing them up because it's important to know that, like, if you've got a problem clearing heavy metals from your brain, well, then you better be like a lot more proactive about checking for heavy metals. And then if you've got high heavy metals, make sure to get them down, figure out the foods that, there's so many of them. There's cobalt, there's chromium, there's cadmium, there's all kinds of other ones. Just to guess, isn't really an effective strategy for decreasing your heavy metals. You really want to know, excuse me, and you want to figure it out if you've got those genes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And similar with some of these other categories, right? Like the carbs, the first gene I wanted to bring up was the FOXO3, because some people, they deal really well with carbs, with their kidneys and their whatever, their liver. But their brain does a really poor job.
Yes.
Right. And then alternatively, some people, their brain does phenomenal with carbs, but their body does really poorly with carbs and they get diabetes or whatever. And then some people just phenomenal with carbs across the board.
Sure.
And that's pretty rare, to be honest. I don't think humans are really designed to eat a high carb diet. I mean,
yeah, me neither.
90+% of people, but you do find that random person that can every once in a while. And usually they think everybody should eat a high carb diet because, they don't get fatigued from it or whatever. But for you've got this gene that gives you a lot more brain fog if you've got a high carb diet. Plus, it actually leads to Alzheimer's risk.
Okay.
At the end of the day, long term. But even in the short term, like I said, you want to optimize your brain performance. Be careful with carbs, man. I mean, if you're eating, a fair amount of carbs, make sure you're training, right, and burning them, putting them into your muscles, and all this kind of thing.
Right.
And you've probably experienced that, right? I mean, you probably know if you eat a huge meal with a bunch of carbs, you just want to take a nap.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. The other question I had here that's a concern for me is I worked with a functional medicine doctor once who looked at this, just my raw data. And he's like, hey, have you ever had any concussions? And I was like, oh boy, because I was a boxer.
Oh, wow.
So I'm like, I don't know. And I was like, I don't know when was a concussion, when wasn't. I know times that, like, my nose was busted open, I'm bleeding. I was like, probably head trauma, like all these different times. So he was just like, okay, like you need to be really careful. He was like, one, don't ever box again. Like you don't want to do that, like sparring and stuff like that. So is that a concern here, having specific genes?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think the ApoE4 gene would be the biggest concern with the head trauma.
Okay.
Um, although people kind of debate that. I just gave a talk for the Special Forces, my second talk for them. It was for like 200 leaders in the special operations at one of these military bases. And the whole talk was about brain optimization. It was based on genes, because most people are just giving these broad recommendations for everybody.
Right.
But you see guys like Julian Edelman, right? These football players that are just getting banged year after year with their head, just getting crushed, and they keep playing, they keep performing at a high level. Now, I don't think that's good for anybody, right? But some people can certainly handle it a lot better than other people, and there are genetic differences there.
Well, there are examples of this too. I remember, I think his name was Chris Henry, I want to say. It was a Cincinnati Bengals receiver, I believe, who had this big domestic dispute with his wife, and there was an accident and he died. But just a whole lot of anger. WWE superstars like Chris Benoit had this famous like murder-suicide of his family, which was crazy. But I know like Chris Henry, Chris Benoit, they do autopsies on these guys.
Yeah, I used to do them.
Really?
I was involved in that.
Wow.
Yeah, that was my lab in Boston. When I used to do Alzheimer's research, I was in my lab. It wasn't me. I wasn't leading that lab, but we were in the New York Times. We were on CNN with Sanjay Gupta, all this kind of stuff. And Anne McKee was the one leading the lab. McKee is MCKEE, I think. Mm-hmm. And I used to go with her every Thursday and do brain cuttings at the morgue.
Yeah.
And it was all these NFL players that had donated their brains, and their families, and the boxers.
Whoa.
And we even had military people that had they basically had, what you end up getting is plaques in your brain from these concussions. Mm-hmm. And then when you have Alzheimer's, there's two different kinds of plaques. There's amyloid, like A beta they call it, and then there's tau, TAU it's called, tau plaques. And when you have Alzheimer's, you've got both of those generally. But with the concussions, you just generally get the amyloid plaques. It's different.
Okay.
And it's kind of a long topic. Like we could literally spend a whole podcast talking about this stuff. But
right.
But the point is, like, for you, I think just looking at your genes, if you had a brain injury, I think you're pretty good, to be honest. You've got excellent genes across the board, really, but especially in the brain category. But if you did have a brain, if you had a concussion, I would say go keto for a while.
Okay.
And a lot of people say that just as a general, piece of advice. But for you, I don't think that's true for everybody. Yeah, I mean, it might help a little bit for most people, but for you, it's especially important. That would be the big strategy, in my opinion.
Okay.
But and for people listening, again, that's a plus gene, meaning you got a bad version from your mother and a bad version from your father. Usually if it's a plus minus, it's a lot harder to predict, because, the plus minus is meaning you got a good copy from one parent and a bad copy of the gene from the other parent. Sometimes your body kind of, it compensates one way or the other. It just uses the good copy of the gene and it shuts off the bad copy. Your DNA can actually get shut off, turned on and turned off.
Sure.
But then that's not always true. So like the plus minus genes are harder to predict. But one example of that is BDNF. So you have a gene, a plus minus BDNF gene, that's brain derived neurotrophic factor. Mm-hmm. And that one, it potentially means you have less BDNF, but it's a plus minus, right?
Okay.
So it does increase your risk for Alzheimer's a little bit, but at the end of the day, as long as you're exercising, usually you're fine, because but an important caveat is endurance exercise, particularly, increases BDNF, whereas heavy lifting doesn't.
Interesting. Because I do not do a lot of endurance training.
Right. So, well, you have plus minus, so it's probably not that important.
Okay.
And there's a ton of supplements that increase BDNF as well. And I think just eating healthy and just doing all this sort of thing increases BDNF. So, but that's an important thing, because quite a few people have less BDNF, and it's associated with lifespan and all this. Like, it declines as you age, and it's probably one of the more important components for increasing lifespan.
Okay.
There's a million things, right? Like the thyroid hormones, they go down as you age.
Sure.
Like your deep sleep goes down as you age. Like sex hormones go down as you age. There's so many things, but BDNF is one of those things. And it's kind of chicken egg. And like, maybe it's just because people aren't exercising as they age, whatever. But by the way, curcumin also increases BDNF, just the supplement.
I saw that in the report. Yeah.
But the thing about you is you've got some of these leaky gut genes that we'll talk about later.
Yes, I would love to get into that.
Oftentimes, and you have a lot of those.
Nice.
Compared to most people, but oftentimes curcumin actually is pretty tough on the gut,
Mm-hmm.
which is ironic because some people it's really beneficial for their gut because it's anti-inflammatory. So if you have gut issues that are related to inflammation that's flipped off by curcumin, then it's a great thing. But if you've got a sensitive gut and it's not related to that form of those types of inflammation, then curcumin can actually be tough on the intestines.
What was interesting too is that you use this example of like inflammation in joints. When I did a Genova Diagnostics, I did a NutriVal and a GI map, and found that like if you take my blood markers like homocysteine or C-reactive protein, it's literally like untraceable. Like I'm below reference range. Right. And then I did the GI map, and it was like you have inflammation in your gut. I'm like, whoa, that's weird. So I have like this localized inflammation in the gut that's not making its way into my bloodstream, I guess, which seems strange.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times you find like with celiac and things, like people are malnourished basically because their gut in response to some of that inflammation, it actually just shrivels up. Like,
wow.
And so, sometimes it's not actually leaky. It's actually just tighter than it should be because, you're not getting anything as a response because you don't want to be pumping bad bacteria into your bloodstream,
Yeah. It's like a built-in defense mechanism.
Like if you want, we can jump down there actually, because I mean, the rest of these brain genes are pretty good. You have a couple anxiety genes relating to serotonin, but a lot of people have those and they're usually okay unless you're eating unhealthy and things like this. And you could certainly like take some of the supplements I recommend there if you have anxiety.
I think that's really cool. You have people can see this in the show notes, but a melancholy and an anxiety section.
Yeah, in your case, relating to serotonin production or serotonin uptake in your brain. You have a little bit of both, so you make a little bit less serotonin and you don't bring it up into your brain as much.
Okay.
And so anything to increase serotonin, just before we jump down to the leaky gut section, I mean, 5-HTP is known to increase serotonin, but I like to take that with tryptophan because tryptophan is it's one of the amino acids and it's a building block for serotonin. So you want to give your body the building blocks and then trigger the manufacturing of serotonin.
That's super helpful.
Some people respond differently. Like some people need to try GABA or St. John's wort or something else. Like those ones, serotonin's a tricky one, right? I mean, that's where all these SSRI drugs, these depression drugs and anti-anxiety drugs, they target serotonin, and it's a complicated system.
Yeah.
That's why I give you a few options here because, it can be a tricky system that different people respond differently to those supplements. That's the epigenetic component you were talking about before.
Sure. I had a question here too, real quick, just in this section, the caffeine metabolism, right? So if we look at this one that I have, caffeine is eliminated by your body more quickly than average. And I see that that's a plus. So is this an example of like plus doesn't necessarily mean bad? It's just you're testing for one specific thing.
Exactly. It's just one of these plus is totally arbitrary.
Gotcha.
So
okay.
In this case, it actually means your liver enzyme is functioning at a high level.
Okay.
To break down caffeine. CYP1A2 is the liver enzyme in this case that breaks down caffeine. So yeah, exactly. It just makes sure that I flag that gene for people because some people have, like I was doing a consult with a professional pitcher in baseball, Major League Baseball, and he had 3 anxiety genes all related to caffeine. And a lot of people do, like there's a lot of people. So to just globally say that caffeine is good for everybody can be a problem if people have a lot of anxiety.
Absolutely.
Because that's just, that can cause inflammation, right? Because there's a lot of stuff going on with anxiety if you got that problem.
Right.
And he knew it. Like he knew that whenever he has caffeine, he gets major anxiety and he's just religious about avoiding it. But some people don't realize that's the trigger in their case. And that's a really interesting thing to kind of compare and contrast. Like how does your body deal with caffeine in terms of the liver? Like do you break it down really quick? Does it stay in your body a long time? Because the worst combo is when you've got anxiety genes for caffeine, plus it stays in your body a long time.
Right.
For those people, it literally, you can drink 1 cup of coffee and 2 days later, you'll still get anxiety.
Yeah.
At a higher level.
Or, I mean, I've talked to clients who they're like, no, you don't understand. Like, I have a cup of coffee at 8 a.m. and I will not sleep that evening. There's no chance.
Exactly. That's the anxiety, usually, not the caffeine. Yeah. Because if you test their blood, the caffeine's not there. So it's clearly something else.
Right. Which is crazy.
Yeah. Most doctors will kind of laugh at people like that and say like, oh, you're full of shit. Like, it's not actually there. It's just mental. Well, in some sense it is mental because you got all this anxiety you've just triggered, and that lasts days sometimes.
So that lasts longer than people talk about the half-life of caffeine or whatever. It's like, it's going to last a lot longer.
The physical caffeine. Exactly.
That's interesting. Yeah. And then it's crazy how individualized it is, because the problem that I see is, if you're in this world of health and wellness and you're trying to self-experiment, do all these things, it's like, if you only listen to Dave Asprey's podcast, you will be like, coffee is good for everyone.
Right.
Everyone must drink coffee, so, and then you'll do it and these little things might creep up and you don't necessarily realize that it's the coffee or caffeine doing it, because you've been told all this time that coffee is wonderful for you and people live longer when they drink 6 cups a day,
Right. 100%. And I mean, the same is, it's across the board, man. Like, the same is true for diets more so than anything, because there's people that are just religious about like, my diet works better than everybody else's diet.
Exactly.
And it's like, it probably does for you.
Right.
But it probably doesn't for 90% of everybody else. But then what they oftentimes will do is they'll promote that diet being like the ultimate for everybody. And then people will try it. It sucks for them. So they stop doing it. But then other people will try it. A few other people find it successful. So they join the club, and then they kind of feed off each other and create that confirmation bias.
Dude, and just how like egotistical is that? Like, if your body is not like mine, you're doing it wrong.
Well, and they don't even realize most of the time they think they don't understand the genetic variability and the epigenetic variability. Because sometimes people do have the same genes, but that's exactly when the epigenetics can kick in, is like, especially with these sex hormones, right? I mean, that's why I wrote a book on estrogen, because the estrogen in particular, we probably talked about this last podcast, but estrogen crosses into the cell. It goes through the cell membrane, which most hormones don't. Most hormones stay on the outside of the cell and they trigger a response on a receptor. And that receptor, like relays the information, like on a relay race that passes the baton. But estrogen goes right through your cell membrane. It goes into the cell. But not only that, your DNA is protected by a membrane as well, right? You have a nuclear membrane, it's called. It's even more stringent. Like, it protects your DNA from getting damaged. Estrogen goes through the DNA membrane as well. It goes directly into your DNA. So it can flip all these genetic switches.
Wow.
And it can get passed on to future generations. Those switches can get flipped and changed and passed on.
Yeah, we talked about that in the last podcast. That's crazy, man. It's scary.
Exactly. So sometimes what your parents did in their diets actually impacts you in terms of what's better or worse in your case. And that's going to be a big one 10 years from now. People will understand that, hopefully.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's dig into these, the leaky gut genes. So this is now section 2 of your report, which is diet optimization genes. And now there are a whole bunch of things listed here.
Yeah. I mean, intermittent fasting, you have a bunch of genes where that's more optimal.
Okay.
But that's really true. If there's one thing that pretty much is optimal for everybody in terms of your genetics, it's intermittent fasting. Almost everybody has genes where intermittent fasting is beneficial. Now, of course, if you're a professional athlete or if you're trying to put on weight or muscle mass or whatever, and you're 20 years old, go ahead and eat breakfast. So you can't keep up with the amount of calories, that sort of thing. There is an argument to be made, but you probably are going to suffer a shorter lifespan if you keep carrying that out. I mean, almost for sure. Right?
Yeah. I tell people that all the time, that like next level, like the highest levels of athletic performance almost always come at the expense of longevity.
Exactly. Well, for sure. I think they do, but it's hard to prove that, they probably always do, but it's impossible to really make that, like, to prove that in a bulletproof way.
Right.
But some people are willing to make that exchange and say, okay, I'm decreasing my lifespan potentially, but I want to be a professional athlete. So this is what I'm going to do. And then maybe at age 50, they should flip that. They should turn that around and start focusing on longevity. And they're probably fine if you do it that way.
Exactly. Right.
But that's what you're seeing when you look at a lot of those genes that you've got, intermittent fast is important. Here's a bunch of genes. But yeah, the leaky gut, I mean, that's where you really light up. Thankfully, you don't have too much heart disease risk too, by the way, just as high. I mean, there's literally like, potentially probably at least 100 genes involved in heart disease risk. And there are all these different categories. So that's another one I want to bring up before we go to leaky gut, actually, just like the brain, where people, they write these books or and they just kind of, globalize everything and say, look, here's the way to fix Alzheimer's, right? Mm-hmm. Just do ketosis or whatever. And it's like, well, maybe, but what if you've got high heavy metals? Like what if, whatever, there's all these different categories that they're kind of ignoring or they're just not aware of or whatever. And heart disease is similar, where you get books just focus on lectins, right?
Right.
And yeah, for like 10% of people, man, that's a phenomenal way to protect your arteries, because there are genes that are sensitive to inflammation from lectins.
Okay.
They're even called like mannose binding lectin and things like that, like MBL and things like MBL2 and things like that. Mm-hmm. And again, you don't have any of these, but I want to bring it up because a lot of people have these, right? And so that's a phenomenal way to protect your arteries if you've got those genes. But then other people, it's related to hyaluronic acid or flavonoids or high iron. Like there's a gene called superoxide dismutase number 2, SOD2. If you've got that gene, it gives you a 10-fold higher risk for heart disease, basically plaques in your arteries, if you've got high iron.
Wow.
And if you don't have high iron, there's really no risk.
That's so interesting.
These people that are just pounding the liver, right? Because they're told that's a healthy thing to do, but they have that gene. And again, you don't, by the way, just so you know, but
perfect.
But like a 10-fold higher risk for heart disease is crazy, because literally like a third of people are getting heart attacks, like in America.
It's insane.
And so if you want to add 10-fold on top of that, I mean, it's outrageous how high your risk is.
Yeah.
And in those people, like I would go to Joseph Mercola, because I think he has that gene. He talks about it.
Okay.
And he's written like 3 or 4 articles on optimal levels of iron, because the medical reference ranges are pretty crappy.
Yeah. Yeah. You directed me to Mercola after the last podcast too.
Yeah. I do pretty regular. Like he's got great info on iron specifically, because again, he's done more research than I have. So it's not like because there's different ways. There's transferritin, or there's ferritin, there's transferritin. There's all these different ways to measure iron. Mm-hmm. And again, thankfully you don't have that gene. I wanted to bring it up as an example because a lot of people do. And there's, like I say, there's books on this stuff, but the books, they exclusively focus just on the one gene. Right. Or maybe not one gene, but one category of like where heart disease is coming from. And everybody should go on this diet that's lectin free or whatever.
Well, like you said, my way is the best way. It tends to look like that,
Yeah. And that's a really strong example. Now, thankfully, the main risk you've got is from triglycerides. If your triglycerides are high, you do have a heart disease risk, but I doubt they're high, to be honest.
No, they're quite low. Yeah.
They're probably 70, if I had to guess. I didn't actually look at your blood work, to be honest, but
no problem.
I mean, if you have it, if you have it available, you could probably just throw the number out there.
I do. Yeah, I can check that right now. Let's see.
Maybe they're 50.
Well, 83. So not in the
83.
70s.
Oh, that's close. Well, I mean, as long as it's below 125, there's literally people that are like 500s, in these medical trials where they're like testing drugs to lower triglycerides, which is hilarious because it's so easy to lower triglycerides. If you're at the 500s, that's absurd. That just tells me you're just sitting around eating Cheetos all day on your couch. I mean, basically, exercise is one of the most important ways to lower triglycerides because you're flushing your blood through your liver and allowing your liver to clear them out. So if you're just totally not moving your body at all, then your triglycerides are sky high. And it's like, well, don't take a drug. Like maybe in the interim, you need to take a drug because it's super dangerous to be that high. But let's be honest, like you just need to stop eating garbage and get moving.
That's just that you're doing everything wrong at that point.
Yeah. So for you, I'm not worried at all about that.
Well, I wanted to check with you on this too, because this has been like my obsession lately has been this lean mass hyperresponder thing. I mentioned it to you briefly in the last podcast. So I would be what's called just a textbook lean mass hyperresponder.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, your actual LDL was what, like 300-400?
Oh, it's off the charts, man. Let me see. I just lost. When did that just go?
I forgot about that. I should have looked into that more carefully. I mean, interestingly, you don't really have the genes for that. So that's more of an epigenetic thing.
Okay. Well, what I'm blown away by right now is like all of my dad's uncles died of heart attacks. Like his brothers have had widowmaker heart attacks and all this stuff. So my dad and I have been really concerned about this. Like I want to get a calcium score done and just see what that is. But this lean mass hyperresponder thing, again, these individuals, like variance between individuals. I was talking to Rob Wolf about this the other day because he shared an article with me about LDL appearing, the higher LDL levels appearing to be positively associated with lifespan.
It's protective.
Yes, and protective.
Right. It is. I'm a huge proponent of that. I mean, people are literally so dogmatic in science. I mean, I did my PhD on cholesterol, right? On hormones and cholesterol. Like LDL is one of my specialties. And it's so hilarious to read these scientific studies where you decrease your LDL, so they just automatically assume that's a good thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And then they say like, it's a great supplement or it's a great thing to do because it decreased LDL. And it's like, yeah, but there's no, like the evidence for that is really, it's not even true. It's not true at all. Like it's ridiculous.
Well, the other thing is, correct me if I'm wrong here, but this whole lean mass hyperresponder thing, it's like, could LDL be a problem? Well, maybe if you're insulin resistant or like your LP little a is off the charts or all these or systemic inflammation, like that's the thing. If I'm looking at C-reactive protein is like untraceable, homocysteine is basically untraceable, low triglycerides, low body fat percentage.
Right. Yeah. Well, for you, looking at your genes, I'm not really that worried about the LDL. What I am worried about is your leaky gut. So that's where you would get the inflammation, right? Like for you, your family members probably had a lot of inflammation from all these leaky gut. They probably have a lot of these similar leaky gut genes.
Sure.
And then once your gut's leaking or inflamed and all this, then those inflammatory chemicals are going, into your arteries. Now, again, for you, you're testing those chemicals, you're finding they're blank, you're eating healthy, but obviously a lot of your extended family probably isn't, because that's true of pretty much everybody's extended family. And that's where the heart disease risk is connected.
What was scary here is, like, I'll give you an example. My dad's older brother had a widowmaker heart attack. The only reason he survived was because he had the widowmaker inside an ambulance.
Wow. Yeah.
Like it happened in the ambulance
right.
because he was having these chest pains. But this is literally someone who was running like 6 miles a day, starting every day with breakfast was like oatmeal with sliced bananas on it. Like he was basically doing textbook American Heart Association diet,
right. Right. Yeah, man. I mean, and I just posted on Instagram a few days ago or a week ago or something, the study 2019, it's called Total Cholesterol and All-Cause Mortality by Sex and Age, a prospective cohort study among 12 million adults.
Yeah.
And they showed, you probably saw this, but basically once you started to get below 200 on your total cholesterol, there's actually a lot higher hazard ratio. It just goes way up. It's what's called a bell curve, or it's like a U shape.
The U shape, right.
But what's funny is like the U is a lot higher. Like it's a lot riskier to have low cholesterol than it is to have high cholesterol in terms of like all these disease risks.
Yeah.
At least in terms of all-cause mortality. It's like kind of a lopsided U, because the low cholesterol was far worse than the high cholesterol. And it took really high cholesterol to even creep up the curve a little bit. But there is an optimal range for sure. And people should look at that Instagram picture.
Well, see, I'm glad you've gone here because I wanted to pick your brain about, I remember your Instagram post and was like, I need to talk to him about this. I'm so glad you brought that up. This U-shaped curve is really what's tripping me out. And this is what I was talking to Rob about as well, is I want to say this out loud and share this to give people an example, because people come to me and they're like, my cholesterol is 220 and my doctor wants to put me on a statin.
Yeah, they do too. Yeah, it's crazy. That's crazy.
It's nuts.
If you get above 350 total cholesterol, then I do get a little bit worried in general, just so you know.
Okay.
And
so that's what I want to share with you here, because the people, Clovis people who are listening, if you're at 200 cholesterol and your doctor wants to put you on a statin. So
it's absurd. It's absurd. Yeah.
My total cholesterol is 545.
Yeah.
And my LDLP, which is my LDL particle number, it's literally out of reference range. It just says greater than 3,500.
Right.
So,
right.
I mean, it's just staggeringly high.
Yeah. I mean, I would definitely do the calcium CT right?
Okay.
And you're doing all the right stuff in terms of checking inflammation. Like you can have outrageously high cholesterol and have no issues if your inflammation is just like spot crystal clean.
Right.
But the problem is there's a lot of forms of inflammation. Like one of them is called CDK, right? And you've got one of these leaky gut genes, CDKAL1.
Okay.
And CDK, it's like, I always use the analogy of hot water. Like if you got your hot water turned on too high, you got too much inflammation, you got to turn that hot water down.
Mm-hmm.
And these CDK genes that people have, there's a lot of them. They help to turn that hot water down, right?
Mm-hmm.
And but the problem is you've got one of these genes where you don't turn the hot water down as much as you should, but there's actually flavonoids in plants that will basically do it for you, right? They shut off that form of inflammation.
Okay.
And so flavonoids are really important. But there's other forms of inflammation like interferons, there's interleukins, there's a whole bunch of interleukins.
Right.
Like nobody's checking interleukin 23. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
Like you'll never get a blood test and the doctor will be like, well, let's check your interleukin 23, right? Because there's so many other ones and they're all different forms of inflammation. So it can be a bit of a crapshoot.
Okay.
And so I agree with you to check, the calcium CT scan.
Okay.
I've seen people totally reverse that and go down to 0 with a really high scan if they do the right thing. Usually when we look at their DNA, we can figure that out. But I do get nervous. I'm not kidding. Like I don't want to water it down. I do get nervous when it gets above 350.
Yeah, I want to know this, for sure.
Yeah, and saturated fat definitely increases LDL, like cholesterol. There's no question.
So that is the thing here, man, is this blood work, just, full transparency, this blood work was done by Paul Saladino, and this was after a 6-week strict carnivore experiment.
Yeah.
I didn't even do black coffee. I mean, and it was virtually a 100% red meat, liver, and egg diet.
Yeah. Interesting.
And I've never seen my numbers this high.
Yeah, I drop it. I mean, I want to see people below 350, and I don't want them using statins to do it. And you don't need to generally. Like, to be honest, the vegan diet is phenomenal at lowering LDL. Usually it lowers it way too much, and then people think they're phenomenal. I was just actually one of the special operators in the military I was talking to. We were looking at his blood work, and because I spent the whole day there, on this secretive Air Force base or this military base, and I actually had to sign paperwork saying, like, I'm not going to publicize it on social media and all this kind of stuff.
Oh, wow.
But anyways, his cholesterol was just way too low, for performance. And of course his doctors were basically giving him high fives for it. And I'm like, man, dude, this is not optimal at all. And you could tell, like, he could feel it, like his sex hormones were starting to go down. It was so low. Yeah. Things like that. And I want to see you at 200. I want to see you at 220, 250, to be honest. Okay. I don't want to see you getting too low, below that. Right. But I don't want to see above 350 either. Right. Because then it's touch and go. Whether, like I say, there's so many forms of inflammation. It's really a complicated topic. Yeah. Like, for example, there's some genes called HLA, HLA-DQA1 or HLA-DRB9, and all these HLA genes. And they are another form of inflammation, but it's triggered by high insulin, which I'm not worried about in your case, right? I mean, what's your blood sugar is like 80, if I had to guess? I didn't look. Let me check here. I got it all. 85. Yeah. It's probably 85. Glucose, 91. 91. Okay. And that was fasted or after coffee, probably? You probably had coffee. No, that was fasted. No coffee. I did this 100% fasted, water fast. No coffee? Okay. Yeah. So you might want to bring that down a little bit. If I was you, I would take zinc. I don't know if you're supplementing zinc at all. No, I'm not. But you did have a zinc transporter gene issue. Like, scroll up a little bit on the DNA report, and on page 4, you'll see right in the middle, there's type 2 diabetes risk for zinc. Yes. It's SLC. And I noticed you put priority there. Yeah, supplementing zinc is a priority for you because basically, I mean, you can get enough from red meat, but you got to eat a shit ton of red meat. Okay. It's probably better just to take a zinc supplement and not worry about, did I get 200 grams of red meat or whatever? Right. Because it's good for your hormones, also your testosterone and things. Great. That'll actually help with your blood sugar. Okay. Nitric oxide will too, by the way, just looking at the gene above that. But I think zinc, you're right on the border. I think you're good there. It's not concerning. It's, it's easy to drop a couple points.
See, and this goes back to, I heard this too in Dave Feldman's lean mass hyperresponder group, where people seem to have the same exact thing that I do, where this, particularly people that are in any way, shape or form gearing towards the carnivore thing, their fasted blood glucose seems to be a little bit elevated.
It is. Yeah. If you're doing this on carnivore, for sure, because your body's what you're doing. And I just wanted to check your metformin gene, which I can bring up in a second. But what you're doing with carnivore is you're basically teaching your body to convert protein to sugar.
Right.
Because that's what's going to happen, right? You're not going to convert protein to fat because you can't.
Yeah.
So, I mean, these really high protein diets, you basically upregulate your body's enzymes to convert the amino acids into carbs.
Gotcha.
And so it does bump up your carbs, right? I mean, that's just the way your body works. But it's not, 91 is definitely good. Like, I'll bet if you checked it tomorrow, you'd be 89, you check the next day, you'd be, 87, like it kind of bounces around. It's one of those things. But I'd probably drop it a little bit. Like I say, take some zinc,
Yeah, that's great. And I love that we're putting some of these dots together, connecting them, because this lean mass hyperresponder thing. So again, I've been just obsessed with this. I'm like, is this like, am I protecting myself? What's going to happen with this cholesterol stuff? And obviously with my family history, I'm really concerned. Mm-hmm. And another thing that Rob said was, it's Rob Wolf. So he has all these wonderful connections with really smart people. And he was like, I was talking to some people who really know their shit. Mm-hmm. And they are suggesting that lean mass hyperresponder could be low-level hypothyroidism. So I went and looked at my blood work, and sure enough, my T3 is low.
Yeah, you have a bunch of genes.
And he's like, that's exactly what would be low in this scenario.
Yeah, and that's genetic. Like, I know we keep looking at the leaky gut, like we're going to talk about it and then we bounce away from it, but let's do that. Let's bounce away from it for a second and go all the way down to your thyroid section, which is on page 8. Page 8.
8. Got it.
You've got, a lot of people are blank in this category. They've got nothing going on here. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 gene issues in the thyroid section, right? One of them is reduced conversion of T4 to T3, by the way. So you're not, you're probably not converting a lot of T4 into T3.
Makes sense.
But definitely take iodine. That's the fundamental point with all of these is if you're not, like, iodine is a building block for the thyroid hormones. If you're not getting enough iodine, then you can't make enough thyroid hormones, and you're definitely going to be at a problem.
Okay.
In the problem situation, because with all of these genes, right? You're genetically just set up. That's really interesting. You should try that experiment.
Yeah.
Try getting your thyroid hormones up. If you have to, take, Armour thyroid or straight up T3 or something, but you got to work with a doctor on that, because you don't want to go if you go too high, you get your heart all screwed up,
Okay.
Sometimes permanently, you go into AFib permanently.
Wow.
So you don't want to be like, oh, let's just take 2 grams of this thyroid med or whatever, like just take loads of stuff. You want to ease into that really carefully, even if the doctors say, like, here's how much you should take. Like, I would start with like 1/4 of that and kind of ease into it.
Okay.
Potentially. But again, definitely work with somebody who's good on that.
Yeah. I only tend to work with doctors like you or Paul, or true, like just guys that I 100% trust. Yeah.
True. That's huge. That's valuable. The other thing is intermittent fasting really helps with your thyroid. In your case, you've got these genes called FOXE1. I call it, like, usually just call it FOXE1, like Foxy Lady.
Yeah.
And FOXE1, FOXE1 is, they discovered it in Chernobyl, like the radiation accident, because people that had thyroid issues, or they had radiation exposure and they damaged the thyroid, the people that healed up fine had the good version of this gene. The people that really struggled to heal, they had the bad version of this gene, like you've kind of got here. Mm-hmm. And it's related to autophagy in your thyroid gland. Mm. So basically, your cells in your thyroid aren't taking out the trash as well as they should.
Interesting.
They're not clearing the garbage. And the best way to increase autophagy, the best way to get those cells taking out the trash, is intermittent fast.
Okay.
Right? Like just noon to 6 or something like that.
Sure.
Like only eating between noon and 6. And of course, like I say, you throw iodine in the mix and you'll probably bump your T3 up sufficiently to be good. And then it'll be interesting to see how your LDL responds to that.
Yeah. That could be really cool.
And if you have to, like I say, I'm not opposed at all to just pulling out the vegan diet for a month, just to really shoot your cholesterol down.
Yeah, right.
Like it's a tool in a toolkit, and I'm not a fan at all of using it long-term.
Yeah, of course.
For virtually anybody, but a short-term strategy to lower LDL, it's pretty phenomenal.
Well, I guess the question that I have there, so if we look at all these leaky gut genes that I have.
Exactly. Let's go back to that. That's exactly what I was looking at. I was thinking about that because the big one you've got that's going to be an issue for vegan is the ATG16L1. You've got 2++ on that gene. Mm-hmm. And man, people that have that gene, they do terrible with grains.
Exactly. That's the thing. So if I was going to try something like that, my understanding of virtually all leaky gut is caused by plant foods.
Yeah, pretty much. Exactly.
So that's tricky, right?
Exactly. Especially with that gene. Right. But, I think if you avoid the grains, if you do vegan, vegetarian, whatever, even like I say, just for a little bit, don't do it forever, but it'll just to shoot your cholesterol down. Mm-hmm. Definitely avoid the grains, avoid all forms of grains. Just don't even mess with them. That gene is actually related to autophagy as well, by the way. It's called autophagy related 16L1. That's the actual name of the gene, I believe.
Okay.
And, but despite the name, I think if you were intermittent fasting and eating tons of grains, it's still not optimal. In my experience, like people with that gene, they just really suffer with the grains. It's not even worth messing with.
Right.
I mean, that's a big one. Another one that's that IBD5. Do you see that one?
Yep.
And let me just pull up my notes on that.
Mushrooms.
Yeah, mushrooms come up a few times.
Bro, I take mushrooms all the time. You don't even have to worry about it.
Yeah, they help your gut for sure. And not a lot of people talk about, well, that IBD5, it's called inflammatory bowel disease number 5. Like it's actually named inflammatory bowel.
Okay.
Because it's so linked to that. It's either through a form of inflammation, like scientists debate like crazy exactly how this gene causes gut inflammation.
Okay.
So just so you know, it's not like clear cut one way or the other on this one, but
sure.
It's either from something called ergothioneine transport, and I'll talk about that in a second, ergothioneine, or it's from interferons, like having too much of this form of inflammation called interferons.
Okay.
And that's why I link an article there about how to decrease interferons from selfhacked.com. I'm a huge fan of that website. I'm a scientific advisor for that website.
Cool. I met that dude.
Joe Cohen. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy. I like him. But of course, the website has a lot of pro soy stuff on there, which I'm not a fan of. Just so people know, but I don't.
Yeah.
I don't throw the baby out with the bathwater type thing. It's like, yeah, they're pretty big fans of soy. I'm not. I think you can debate on that, but they have so much good stuff. I want to take the good stuff they do have and utilize it.
Of course.
They actually put the references for the scientific studies that they use, by the way, which is most websites don't. So I really like that. But ergothioneine is a vitamin that nobody talks about. Probably never even heard the word.
I've never heard of it.
And I mean, you're interviewing all these top scientists and all this, right? Like you're in the minority in terms of your exposures to these things. And a lot of people have ergothioneine issues. They, like plants have a little bit of ergothioneine, but mushrooms, they've got like 1,000 times more. They just have like off the charts ergothioneine.
Okay.
And the reason nobody talks about ergothioneine, again, it's a vitamin, right? So your body can't make it, but you need it.
Yeah.
How crazy is that nobody ever hears of it? Even scientists and doctors, they'll be like, oh yeah, I've never heard of it. Ask your doctor. They'll be like, oh yeah, I've never heard of ergothioneine.
Jeez.
And the reason not a lot of people talk about it is because your gut bacteria make it for you in many cases. But if you've got issues transporting it into your gut, right, which you have probably with this gene, then you're not getting the benefits of ergothioneine because you're not bringing it up into your gut. So you want to amplify the amount that you're putting into your system just to make sure you get enough. And again, mushrooms are the way to go. So you're fixing that problem. I'm not too worried about it.
Great.
And, to be honest, most of the other ones relate to just poor diet and stuff, which obviously you don't have.
Right.
I mean, they do these studies on average Americans, right? And who are eating fast food, they're eating processed foods, all this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So most of them I'm not really worried about, other than the kind of, obviously the little blurbs that I have on your report, and then just the stuff we talked about, like the grains are big, and exercise, just the basics, right?
Yeah. Another question I had is on the gym genes that you gave.
Yeah. Let's jump down there.
So I had done DNA Fit,
Yep.
And ran my data through there. And I don't know how accurate that is or whatever, but they had this one section that was like basically 2 different risk factors. And one, it was all about soft tissue. So it's basically saying that in terms of soft tissue risk of injury, I'm a 10 out of 10 risk.
No way.
And it also said that for recovery, like recovering from intense exercise, my recovery need is a 10 out of 10.
Interesting. That's funny. Yeah, definitely not, because most of the genes you have for risk are plus minus.
Okay.
Right. So that's the first thing, right? Like you could have a plus on all of these genes that you do have problems with, like IL1B, that's another interleukin gene, or HLA, that HLA gene, like we mentioned before. Even your collagen gene under the back disc category.
Yep.
Plus minus, right? These are all plus minus. So if you're 10 out of 10 with plus minuses, well, what are you in your plus, right? 10 out of 15? Because
yeah.
You know what I mean? Like you can't be at the max if you're only plus minus.
That's true.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like logically. So first, that's like an obvious problem there.
Yeah.
So the plus minuses really are harder to predict. Now, the back disc genes that you do have, the collagen 11A and the interleukin 1, those ones are pretty predictive. Most people that have those, almost everybody I talk to, they have low back issues at some point in their life. You probably have as well.
Yep. I have a nagging one that never goes away. Yeah.
I have that same issue. Actually, I have those genes, and it's tough, man. I learned how to deadlift actually, and that fixed almost all the problems. I used to throw my back out every year, almost like religiously, like once a year.
Yeah.
Since I was about 12 years old, which is really, really bad. But again, I'm plus, you know, like I'm apparently a 15 out of 10 if you're a 10 out of 10, because I'm actually worse. And I didn't eat healthy as a kid. My family would do cereal every day and all this.
Me too. Yeah.
And so that's a big factor, because I wasn't getting collagen, and I think supplementing collagen is a huge one. But it's been literally 10 years since I've thrown my back out. Once I learned how to deadlift and eat healthy, of course, between those two things. But this year I finally threw my back out again. I was just stressed out doing these talks for the military and just traveling and hiking. And every time I go and do a talk, I always go fishing or do something crazy like hiking in the mountains and fishing up in the mountains.
That's awesome.
So I managed to throw my back, and to be honest, what really fixed it this time, it took a long time and it wasn't getting fixed. And I just got on some testosterone and bumped that way up, because testosterone is a way to increase healing, right?
Sure.
And it massively improves your healing ability. So I figure, well, I'll go off the charts a little bit, like bump my T up pretty high. And then I got off it right away after a couple of weeks, but it worked, man. I mean, my back is rock solid again. I was right, like, it took me about 2 weeks and I was right back in the gym, which I'm really pleased about.
Great.
But for you, for sure, collagen. And then, like I say, that interleukin gene is all about inflammation. And usually, again, the doctors aren't checking interleukin. It's one that comes up a lot in your genes throughout, right? You saw it in the gut category, you're seeing it in the joints, you see it in the back, you see it all over the place. And, you know, we can check it. Like in the research world, we check interleukins, you know?
Okay.
So it can be done, like probably even through Quest. If you talk to your doctor about checking interleukin, it might be worth it.
Okay.
That would be like the root cause of a lot of issues, if you can figure out ways to lower that. And there are a lot of ways. And that's why I linked that self-hacked article on interleukin 1 right there.
Sure.
But the joints, you know, to be honest, they're not that bad. You know, I've seen a lot worse. As long as you're not shooting your blood sugar way up, you know, if you're like 120 on your blood sugar, I'd be panicking. You know? Not really,
absolutely.
But I would definitely put you on keto for a bit.
Right.
Things like that. And to be honest, you don't have any in the iodine section. Like some people have a lot of joint issues because their thyroid hormones are off.
Yeah.
And how often would you go to an orthopedic surgeon? Like you need a knee replacement and they're going to say, well, let's check your thyroid hormones first, right? They'll never do that.
Never.
And another really interesting one you'll never hear your orthopedic surgeon. My brother's an orthopedic surgeon, by the way, so I can make fun of these guys a little bit.
Nice. And
at the Mayo Clinic, I worked in with all these orthopedic surgeons, because when I'm researching stem cells, I have to work with these guys. But it's hilarious because you've got a gene called HTR2A, right, in that joint category, and basically it's a risk for all kinds of joint issues, and it's related to serotonin, which is something, again, you'll never hear your orthopedic surgeon pay any attention to. Like, oh, you maybe need to increase your serotonin, right? because you've got some joint stuff, but instead they'll just go right into the replacements, and which is a vicious cycle you'll never get off, right?
Yeah.
So actually using those serotonin boosting supplements will probably, well, they have some benefits for your joints as well. They may not totally fix them because that's not the only thing you've got, but they might, you know, you never know, because you do have a lot of other things dialed in, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's the thing too. I always recommend to people, if they haven't, just getting Quest or working with a doctor or whatever, because I've done like the cholesterol thing. I've done these blood draws, extensive blood work, like once a quarter for years now.
Yeah.
So it's like, I know immediately that this was after a 6-week carnivore experiment. I know that I've done before where I'll still stay keto, but do more like wild caught fish and some pasture raised chicken and some avocados, and the LDL just drops, total cholesterol drops. It's like, you can drop this stuff so quickly,
right?
You know,
100%. Yeah, like I say, if you really want to pull the stops, you go vegan. I mean, the guys that are vegan are just in the tank on their LDL, and their testosterone is in the tank and all this kind of stuff, and their energy is in the tank, and they're bragging about it because the doctors say they're good, you know?
Exactly. Yeah.
But it is an effective strategy for like in the very short term.
Short term. Yeah.
And that's an unpopular thing to say, but it's also unpopular to say carnivore diet is phenomenal in certain cases. And I'm happy to say it. Like there's certain genes there's these things called plant sterols, right? There's cytosterols, SITO, cytosterols. And there's quite a few. I was just talking to somebody last week who had trouble. They have genes where they have trouble clearing those plant cholesterol. So humans have cholesterol, LDL, HDL, all that, right? That's the human form of cholesterol. Plants actually also have cholesterol. It's kind of cytosterols. It's different.
Yeah.
Most people don't realize like we have different types of cholesterol, animals versus plants.
Absolutely.
And most people, they eat plants, their body clears out those plant cholesterols, no big deal. But there are about 5% of people out there where they can't clear those plant cholesterols. They do a terrible job of it. And they build up in your body. And if cholesterol becomes oxidized, like the problem with getting really high cholesterol is the cholesterol itself is inflammatory. Like the problem with being at 500, the cholesterol is sitting in your blood so long, it reacts with oxygen. And that oxidized cholesterol is actually inflammatory in and of itself.
Okay.
Right. So irrespective of CRP and all these inflammatory markers, the cholesterol itself can be inflammatory. And the problem with getting the plant cholesterol super high is those ones get oxidized and they get inflammatory. And the bigger problem is doctors never check your cytosterols, right?
Right.
Now for you, thankfully, you don't have those genes, but I'm bringing it up because enough people do that it's important.
And I actually tested, I do have those listed in this blood work as well, which is nice.
Oh, right. You have cytosterols?
Yeah. So I have cytosterol and campisterol.
Oh, rock on, man. You got a good doctor. And those are probably good. Right.
Yes, they are both normal.
It might even be a super low. Yeah.
Yep. Now what I do have is oxidized LDL is high.
Oh yeah.
It's over 135.
Yeah, exactly. Because your LDL is super high. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying, right? Like if you've got really high LDL and it's sitting in your blood too long and gets oxidized, you can measure that.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's a dangerous thing. I have published peer-reviewed papers on oxidized LDL, and it's reactive stuff, right? It's just like anything else. It's inflammatory. But the point is, like, if you've got these risk genes for high cytosterols, and by the way, you're like one of the few people, I mean, maybe even the only person I've ever talked to that's actually had their blood work in front of them with cytosterols on the blood work, which is unbelievably awesome. But I've had people go and get their cytosterols checked, but generally I don't think I've ever had anybody say like, well, I got it right here.
Yeah.
Which is awesome. But again, you don't even have the genes for that. So it's not at risk. But for those people that do have those genes, they're not clearing plant cholesterol. They pretty much should eliminate plants. Like those people, I'm basically adamant that they go carnivore.
Wow.
Even if they're vegans, like you gotta avoid plants, man. And you can take some plant supplements. Like you could take, I don't know, resveratrol or something like I'm not a huge fan of resveratrol because it acts like estrogen at high doses, but you know what I mean? Like you could take those plant supplements because those are purified compounds from plants. They're not the plant cholesterol.
Okay.
You know what I mean? So you can go carnivore and take some of those supplements and that would be a better way to optimize in certain cases if you need some of those supplements. Again, I'm looking at the genetics, right?
Sure.
So I want to cover all the bases. I don't want to be biased and say, I want you to just do this and no supplements ever.
Right. Well, now I had heard that in terms of the plant sterols, that there's actually an argument to be made for someone who would have these problematic genes like you're talking about, that we can actually increase those plant sterols pretty significantly just through things like coffee. Is that true?
Probably, but it's not going to be anywhere near having the genetic issue.
Okay.
Because let's say you're drinking coffee and you're eating loads of plants, right? Like let's say you're a vegan.
Sure.
Right? And your cytosterols are, below the range still, because your body, what happens is if you're carnivore and then you suddenly shift into vegan, right? Your body's like, holy shit, right? Like I'm getting blasted with all these plant cholesterols and these cytosterols, and those will shoot way up because your body can't deal with it. But if you ease into it, your body will start to increase the ability to, it's like trying to change, like if you've got a factory and you're making airplanes and then somebody comes in the next day and says, no, I want you got all the equipment necessary to make semi trucks. Let's do that.
Yeah.
Right. You can't do that suddenly you're not going to be kicking out semi trucks the next day.
Right.
Even though you got all the machines, right? You basically have to modify them in such a way that they're going to, be used to make semi trucks. And that's going to take a few weeks.
Of course. Yeah.
It's the exact same thing. Like if you just make these drastic shifts, yeah, your blood work's going to shoot way up, but then your body is the epigenetics are going to change and you're going to start dealing with those. You're going to make more of the enzymes that clear them unless you have a genetic issue, right? That's where the blueprint is really important.
Yeah. Well, this is a fantastic point, because what I love about this is humans are hilarious in 2019. Like it's such instant gratification, everything. Where like when someone comes from a standard American diet to Clovis, they're like, is this safe? What's going to happen? And I'm like, look, literally, you could be on a Twinkie diet for 2 years.
Right. Lose weight. Yeah.
And you're not going to die.
Right.
It's like that people think that I'm going to do this. I'm going to try vegan for 3 weeks and it's somehow going to kill me.
Right.
Like, no, it just doesn't work that way. People get so obsessed with this stuff.
Right. Yeah.
You can experiment like crazy, right?
Well, yeah, for sure. And you should. I think people should know their body, because you have to, right? Like that's part of just knowledge is power, right? Like Socrates says, know thyself.
Right.
That's why he was considered the smartest man in the world, because, he had a recognition of himself and his self-knowledge. And I think the best way to do that is to experiment and understand your genetics, your DNA code. And, but even there, like I say, you still got to tinker with this stuff.
Absolutely. And that's the thing. People are so afraid to tinker.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, I just don't get that. It's like, just because I preach a certain type of Clovis protocol or whatever, it doesn't mean I wouldn't try vegan to experiment. I've experimented with all sorts of crazy shit,
Oh yeah. Yeah. Same here. I mean, I inject peptides and
yeah. Oh, I got a bunch of peptides. I meant to tell you that.
Rock on. Yeah.
After our last talk,
right.
I got them. I have a connection for peptides now.
Good for you, man. It's really an interesting lever to pull,
Yeah.
And you didn't have any genes that jumped out at me for like needing peptides to fix certain things. Like certainly they work anyway, despite your genetics to a certain degree. But if you've got genes that make it way more important, for certain goals that you might have, then I may have, then I would have included them on this.
Okay.
But yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, man, it's going to be exciting.
Different topic for a different day, probably.
Absolutely.
We could talk all day here.
Man, one thing I was super excited about too is the sleep genes. I know we're probably coming up on time for you, but
yeah, we should go through a couple of those. Yeah, let's go through those and then wrap it up. I mean, I just let me bring up that pain sensitivity gene too, the one in the pain tolerance. Yeah, because basically you have real low pain sensitivity, so you don't feel pain the same way most people do.
That makes a lot of sense in my life.
Yeah, and that's not super common. I mean, the risk for that is, you go for a run or something and at 2 months, you don't feel pain and then blow your knee out completely.
Right.
Whereas like people on the other end of the extreme that have the other version of these genes, they feel pain super acutely and really strong, and they're real sensitive to pain, and then they wimp out way before they should, right? And for those people, you say, well, you got to work through the pain, you got to just suffer a little bit. But for you don't want to do that. You got to be cautious. And that actually tells me too, like if you feel pain in your gut, then you really have a lot of gut issues. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's really interesting in my personal life. I mean, I think I actually thought I was like some kind of masochist or something, because I'm super drawn to just like punishing my body. I don't know why. I've always been that way.
Yeah. So I didn't want to just like gloss over that, because I don't explain that one in the report that you've got. I only kind of explain it when we go through it. But sleep genes, I mean, be honest, you have pretty good sleep genes. You are pretty sensitive to blue light, if you'll notice in that category.
Yeah.
Plus, and that's the only plus you have. So the other ones are a little more optional and, like hit or miss in terms of whether you can predict, but there's some supplement ideas like melatonin, like period circadian regulator gene, PER. That's considered like the pacemaker for your brain, like basically in terms of your sleep cycles, you potentially have delayed sleep cycles. I don't know. Do you track it with Aura?
I do. Yeah. So I track it.
Do you get at least an hour of deep, or do you struggle with
always at least an hour? And that's something that I've been really trying to be a biohacker about. Like actually Dave Asprey talks a lot about this, where he's like, I can sleep 6 hours and I've gotten it to where my deep sleep is 30%. And I'm like, what? That's insane,
Yeah. Those deep sleep inducing peptide is probably the best way if you're going to go that extreme.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, you do have that gene, so it is tougher. Like my wife, man, she'll get 3 hours of deep sleep, like virtually no matter what. She'll wake up with kids and still crank out 3 hours.
What?
Yeah. So
that's amazing.
So like some people are just gifted in terms of, getting that.
Yeah.
And she doesn't do anything to biohack, I think the biggest one for me was eating. Like if I eat in the evening, if I have a snack in the evening, it totally ruins my deep sleep. And
oh, wow.
That's so fundamental, but it's so overlooked by most people. They're like, oh, I have sleep issues. Like, well, do you eat after 6 p.m.? It's like, oh yeah, every night.
Yeah, of course.
Well, let's start there.
The biggest drivers that I've seen in terms of deep sleep, which one that's very well known is alcohol. Yep. And two, I just did this I experiment with all sorts of crazy shit all the time. So I just got an actual THC vape pen.
Yeah.
And was like, I'm going to try this. So I just got stoned a couple nights, and every single time I did that, deep sleep dead.
It's gone. Yep.
Like no deep sleep. I could not, it was the biggest marker mover I've ever seen.
Yep. 100%. I'm not surprised at all. In fact, let me just scroll up and look at your cannabis section if you don't mind.
Sure. And I say that too, because I know so many people that claim they smoke weed before bed because it helps them sleep. And I'm like, I don't think it might help you fall asleep.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And it varies a little bit, different people. I mean, you don't have any like extreme paranoia genes or anything with cannabis.
Which genes are those?
Well, there's a gene called AKT.
Okay.
And you could, some people have the bad version of that gene, and they almost always hate cannabis because it gives them extreme paranoia, uncomfortable paranoia. I mean, everybody gets a little bit if you get really high, but it's like the point where it's, it's just not even enjoyable.
Yeah. People end up like calling the police on themselves and stuff. Like, help me, I'm dying.
Right. No, but I mean, sometimes melatonin actually will mess up your deep sleep as well. So just be aware, but you should try it just as a biohack and see.
So that I've tested pretty significantly.
There you have. Yeah.
And I've tried things like Doc Parsley's sleep remedy.
Yep. Which has vitamin D, by the way.
Oh yeah.
Which lowers your melatonin, but yeah.
Yeah. Which is interesting because I've done Doc Parsley's quite a bit and it's never improved my deep sleep.
Yeah. Yeah. What about melatonin straight? Have you tried that?
I have. Yeah. But I need to check. I usually do the On It spray.
Okay, cool.
And I don't see like astronomically higher deep sleep levels, but I really only mess with the pure melatonin when I'm traveling.
Sure.
So it's not like I need to mess with that at home in my sleep environment and see what the deep sleep does.
Yeah, I'd be curious because, I mean, again, you have a plus minus where melatonin usually is beneficial, but for some people it's the opposite. And that's always interesting. I think the blue light is probably the biggest one for you just to be cautious with. You could try lithium because of that clock gene.
Yeah.
They've done studies showing lithium improves people's sleep when they have that bad version of that gene.
Okay.
And again, that's super low dose. You don't want to go into like the schizophrenia doses type of thing.
Yeah.
And be careful with that lithium orotate. That's most people when they take lithium a lithium orotate. When lithium breaks free of orotate, it releases something called orotic acid, OROTIC, orotic. And orotic acid is literally used in animals as like a liver cancer model to like basically give the animals liver cancer.
Wow.
It's not even that high of a dose. It doesn't take it's a terrible idea. The reason they kind of tout it, a lot of people are buying magnesium orotate now, which I'm appalled with because that one also, it's going to release free orotic acid, and that's really nasty stuff.
Okay.
And the reason they do that is because there's studies showing that there's like if you're completely deficient in magnesium or lithium or any other mineral, and then you take lithium aspartate or magnesium aspartate or citrate or malate or whatever, it gets into your brain, but it's not super fast, But then if you take magnesium orotate, right, or lithium orotate or whatever, it gets into your brain a lot quicker. And then they're like, yeah, it gets into your brain super fast. So like, that's better form. So let's go with that. So all these biohackers are big fans because they see that study or those studies. And the problem is if you're totally deficient, right?
Yeah.
But if you're just consistent about taking it all the time, right, then your levels are already good and your brain's already getting plenty. And then it doesn't make any difference, So why increase your risk for cancer substantially? Anyways, that's just a little.
Yeah. So I guess one thing I wanted to say, just in terms of like the actionable steps. So when we talk about these genes, are we talking about like, you want to get down 95% of your health is like the not smoking, eating a species appropriate, probably some form of ancestral diet, high quality sleep, some exercise, removing toxic products from your environment, right? These things are going to be the biggest return on investment.
Yeah, exactly.
And then it seems like this genetic stuff is the last few percent of optimization.
In some cases, yeah. Although sometimes, like say, for people that have extreme genes, it's pretty massive,
Okay.
But yeah, exactly. If you've got good genes like you've got, it's a 5% difference or whatever. But some people, man, it's tricky because like that liver example at the beginning, right? Like you got risk for high iron, you've got a risk for low retinol, so you need to take retinol, and the best way to do that is usually liver, and then you got this tenfold risk for heart disease because your iron is too high. There's all these intricacies that if the stars align, it can be a real problem, and they can be a massive boost to know your genetics. And then some people it's minor, but I still think it's valuable.
Oh, it's so valuable. Even the little stuff, like someone who suffers from anxiety might not know that they have a caffeine sensitivity related to anxiety. That's super freeing,
Right. I think so too. Yeah.
So the best way for them, I recommend everybody go directly to you, and that would just be the ajconsultingcompany.com, right? And they'd need their 23andMe raw data.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, man. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I've got coaches now too, which are a lot more affordable for people.
Sure.
Because I was getting my wait list was multiple months, like 2 or 3 months. And I kept having to move the price up, and I don't like to do that because I like to be able to talk to normal people, not just pro athletes or whatever.
Right.
I've done MMA fighters. I've done all kinds of interesting people that are active in NFL and MLB and all this. But like I say, I want to be able to reach people that need that, like that have health issues, and that's the solution I have now.
Maybe I'll come to your training, dude. That's what I need to do. I need to become a coach.
Get a coach. Yeah, get the exactly.
That'd be awesome.
That'd be fun. Yeah.
Well, cool, man. Thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it. Thank you for looking at all my data, and we'll put all your links and everything in the show notes so people can get in touch and hopefully work with you.
Thanks, Justin.